Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. All right. Before I turn the program over to our incredible exec staff, I'd like to just take a few minutes to introduce you to our board of directors. My name is Jessica DeJesus, and I serve as the board president. Our vice president is Mr. Devin McCree. Our wonderful secretary is Dr. Kirill Blumen. We have 3 members at large, including Earl Fields, Dr. Paige Tan, and Dr. Jonathan Miner. I would like to introduce our 3 members ex officio, including Professor Daniel Fierstman, Mr. Michael Oliaga, and Ms. Geraldine Galloway, who is also, by the way, responsible for reconfiguring our website. Have anybody checked it out? Yeah? It's about time we're in the 21st century. I cannot forget our founding members, Dr. Cynthia Combs, and Dr. Martin Slan. And last, but certainly not least, our executive director is Michael Gaspar. Now, without further ado, let me introduce you to your 2-time Secretary General for SRMUN Charlotte 2018, Maricruz Retana.
Hi, everyone. How are we? All right. Sounds good to me. Honorable delegates, esteemed advisors, and distinguished guests. On behalf of the SRMUN Board of Directors and the Charlotte 2018 conference staff, it is my distinct pleasure to welcome you either again or anew to the Queen City, and more importantly, SRMUN Charlotte. My name, as you know, is Maricruz Retana, and I have had the absolute privilege to serve for a 2nd consecutive year as the Secretary General for SRMUN Charlotte. Within my tenure of this organization, I have been able to experience many transitions, including that of the start of this very conference in 2013, as well as seeing the growth of this conference from an attendance of 270 delegates to the almost 500 students in attendance today. This transition has been near and dear to me, as I have had the privilege to see firsthand how something so infectious, such as personal, professional, and educational growth, continues to foster into the embodiment of this very organization. This growth is not a singular accolade of the staff and board, but it's a collaborative accomplishment, because without your dedication and commitment to our program, we would be unable to present the forum on which we embark on today. This being said, as a current member of this conference, I'd like to remind you as why we are actually here today. It is not simply because we need to obtain a grade for our political science class or solely for the social aspect that our conference offers, but realistically, we are here for the purpose of simulating the United Nations in all of its glory. Each of you here has been asked to represent national agendas or stances that you may personally disagree with, and as such, it is our hope throughout the next few days that you do so with an open mind, as this is the very attribute missing from our current international attempts at diplomacy. Throughout the course of history, the world has experienced vast changes since the inception of the United Nations on October 24th, 1945. At said point in history, the United Nations solely comprised of 51 member states, whom of which drew up the landmark document known as the Charter of the United Nations. Within the Charter itself, the international community vowed, above all, to make a conscious and collective effort to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war. The writers of the preamble listed this segment first within the Charter because of the timing and the grounds of which the United Nations was built. This was a time following not only World War I, but further World War II, and it was deemed that by coming together, the world would not experience such a traumatic time again. The United Nations, which we all admire because of its principles of maintaining peace and security, is now an organization comprising of 193 member states. Today, it faces not only the challenge of its immense growth from over 70 years ago, but also now faces challenges that have truly been unforeseen. These challenges over the years have changed in both size and number, But what brings us together this weekend is to discuss global interdependence and the changing role of the United Nations. When discussing global interdependence, the focus generally gravitates to globalization. But globalization, more than anything, focuses on world economies intertwining, whereas true global interdependence is all-encompassing in that it is a discussion of the coming together as a global society. This includes but does not limit key topics such as technology, health, culture, religion, migration, and the list just continues. This is a pressing issue for our world, as member states are essentially battling each and every day their national priorities to that of the international and regional agendas and extremities. They have challenges trying to find the balance, if any, between the two or sometimes three levels. You may have already realized within your extenuous research for your assigned member state that it is not an easy task to be able to address political, social, and economic issues with ease, because the climate and situation for each member state differs from one to the next. For example, some member states have to, by no choice of their own, focus their time, energy, and resources to natural disasters more than others just because of geographic location. This is obviously not a pressing issue of all member states, but can ultimately trickle down to affect other member states. Examples can be seen in migration of people, which can affect the economy possibly in one of two ways. Either it can harm other economies in that the migration of people can cause resources of another member state to spread further, or on the contrary, the migration of people could help the economy, because if those people who migrated to this new country started working, they start contributing to this new economy. I know this example is a little bit on the extreme, but it does happen more often than not, hence why this theme is brought to the forefront. The theme, as you may or may not realize, was created and designed with our millennial generation in mind, because we can no longer deny that global interdependence is here. As global citizens, we must understand that this theme will merely be analyzed by the purpose of simulation, but know that will also continue to play a pivotal role within all aspects of our lives. Global interdependence has no easy fix. It has no one single solution, as it encompasses so many aspects of our lives, but it is our hope that over the course of the next few days, you are able to not only challenge your peers, but that you can challenge one another to come up with viable solutions when discussing your prospective topics. The question before us, then, is therefore, is not whether global interdependence is good or bad, right or wrong, evil or virtuous, but instead we must analyze how we as an international community can adapt our policies, priorities, and personal choices to account for the realities of global interdependence, because it is very well may be the distinguishing factor between our era and our predecessors. In a world that is constantly breaking down barriers, we can no longer think and act in the name of our own national integrity. Instead, we must consider tangible, regional, and more importantly, international solutions that will contribute to a cohesive mankind. In close, we understand that this is a huge task to undertake, but we cannot wait to see the outcomes that you collectively generate for the topics we have chosen for your simulation. Now, at this time, I'm going to introduce our keynote speaker, which is none other than Mr. Richard Kaslerich. Mr. Kaslerich is no stranger to the effects of global interdependence. At the present time, he is a distinguishing visiting professor at George Mason University, the Schar, am I correct on that? The Schar School of Policy and Government. There he teaches courses in the geopolitics of energy security and policy communications. Prior to his current venture, he served as a National Intelligence Officer for Europe on the National Intelligence Council from September 2003 to April 2011. Prior to that position, he was director of the Special Initiative on the Muslim World at the United States Institute of Peace. Ambassador Kaslerich joined the Institute in spring of 2002 after a 32-year career in the Foreign Service. He served as United States Ambassador to Bosnia and Herzegovina from 1997 to 1999, and as well served as the Ambassador to Azerbaijan from 1994 to 1997. He was the Senior Deputy to the Secretary of State and the President's Special Representative to the newly independent states in 1993 to 1994. He was Deputy Assistant Secretary of State in the Bureau of European Affairs in 1991 to 1993, where he was responsible for relations with the former Soviet Union and economic ties with the European Union. Ambassador Kazlerich also served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for the International Organization Affairs in 1984 through 1986, and as Deputy Director of the State Department's Policy Planning Staff in 1986 to 1989, where he handled global and international economic issues. He was also Director of the Department of State's Operations Center from the period of 1983 to 1984. And in addition to his ambassadorial assignments, Ambassador Kazlerich has served at U.S. embassies in Ethiopia, Israel, and Togo. He received his AA from Black Hawk College, his BA from Valparaiso, MAs from Indiana University and the University of Michigan. He is a member of the National Council of the College of Arts and Sciences and the Advisory Board on IT and Cybersecurity at Valparaiso University. Ambassador Kazlerich is a member of the American Academy of Diplomacy in Dakar, and he is on the Advisory Council of the Eurasia Foundation. So he does a lot. And has done a lot. And we are extremely excited to have Ambassador Kazlerich with us today at SRMUN Charlotte, and ask that you now join me in welcoming him.
My late mother, who died last fall at the age of 100, always tried to figure out what I did for a living because I never seemed to have a job for very long. But that's kind of the generation that I grew up in. But thank you very much for that introduction, and to the organizers of this event. These are so important, not only for you as participants, but also for our country and for the international organizations that you're going to be involved in. I really don't know of any other way to learn diplomacy than to practice diplomacy, and that is really what you're going to be doing for the next several days. It's an opportunity to simulate how the United Nations works, how countries and individual diplomats advance national interests in the pursuit of peace. And I'm really glad that I found almost all of my countries represented here. Togo, who's representing Togo? Hey, there. My first post in the Foreign Service. I'm glad to see you here. Ethiopia, is Ethiopia represented? I missed them. Oh, good.
Oh, they're right there.
Yeah, terrific. If you ride in from the airport here to Charlotte, say Tadastaling to the driver, because 90% chance the driver's Ethiopian. And I got a real up-to-date briefing on what politics are, so I can help you guys. Israel, how about Israel? I saw them on the list somewhere. Yes? No? How could you have a UN meeting without Israel? They have been the object of, for good and bad, the attention of the United Nations from the founding of the state in 1948 to the current day. I didn't see Azerbaijan, but I did see Armenia. Is Armenia here? No? I thought I saw Armenia on the list. Another area with UN focus. And then Bosnia and Herzegovina, I don't know if they were on the list or not. But my experience in my foreign service career has been in places where the United Nations has really been very important, either as a direct or indirect actor. But what I'd like to do this afternoon is talk to you a little bit about diplomacy. George Shultz, who was Secretary of State during Ronald Reagan's presidency, and with whom I had a chance to work with when I was Deputy Director of the Policy Planning Staff, described diplomacy as the method as distinct from the content of foreign policy. And I think it's good that you are going to be assigned positions that you may not personally agree with, because that's the content of what diplomats do. It's the method of how do you accomplish the objectives of your country or your organization that are going to be particularly important. What you're going to be able to control as diplomats is the method, but you're really not going to have a chance to dictate what the policy is, because that's going to come from higher levels of political authorities. So here's a dirty little secret, and any professors in the audience will have to close their ears for this. Diplomacy is an acquired skill. It's a practice, and it's not something that can be learned and not something that can be taught. So what you're doing is, in a sense, involved in a very important part of your education if diplomacy is going to be the field that you work in, because you're learning it by practice. And this opportunity here, I think, is something that you'll look back on as being very, very important for your future. What I'd like to use my time here is to talk about two mentors that I had in my career in the Department of State. One is Ambassador Chaz Freeman. Chaz is one of these guys. He was ambassador to Saudi Arabia, but he really made his name in the Foreign Service because he spoke Chinese fluently. And guess who was the translator for Richard Nixon's trip to China? Chaz Freeman. And if there's anybody, you can see his books. He's got a website. He loves to talk. He's very good at it. But go to his website and just look at the background of this wonderful public servant. And then I'd like to talk about former Secretary of State George Shultz, who I think has just had a 97th birthday. And this guy is sharp as a tack. And guess what his big deal is now? Climate change. So two really tremendous people. But let me start with Chaz, because he has written about what the difference is and what the characteristics are of a diplomat and what the difference is between diplomats and scholars. And for people like me who've kind of come into the academic world through the back door, I've spent almost 40 years working in government, and then I find myself at George Mason University having a lot of fun teaching courses that I really enjoy. But you know, we really don't understand the two worlds that we are involved with in this transition. And practitioners like me tend to be a little critical of scholars. It's not fair, but we are. Chaz has taken the time to actually sit down and explain why we are different. And I think it's worth hearing some of these points, because he believes that the following are characteristics of diplomats. First, diplomats pride themselves and succeed because they are good critical thinkers. And that's kind of what scholars do as well, right? Secondly, diplomats tend to have empathy more than revealed knowledge, texts, or quantitative analysis as the basis of what they do. Chaz understands China better than anyone I know, but it's because through his language skills he's developed this empathy for China and the Chinese people. Third, diplomats' insights are beyond just simply an intellectual interest in international relations, but into what makes foreigners do foreign things. If you're going to be a diplomat, you better understand why the people on the opposite side of the table are saying and doing the things, because they don't think just like you do. Diplomats tend to be grounded in personal experience, apprenticeship, and area knowledge. When I left the Department of State in 1999, I still felt I was an apprentice. Every day I was learning something new. Diplomats tend to be culture-specific, reliant on intuition, and attuned to emotion as well as reason as a behavioral determinant. Why do, in negotiating settings, why do certain countries, certain diplomats become very emotional about what they're doing? That's not a characteristic, by the way, we teach entering diplomats to express that much. But to understand emotion is terribly important. Diplomats are tested in daily professional interactions with counterparts. That's what you're going to be doing the next few days. Happily, for those of you who've written academic papers, diplomats function in a footnote-free environment. It's applied scholarship that seeks truth from foreign facts and tries to use this to influence particular foreigners. And that's what you will be doing with your negotiations. Diplomats embrace the lore of international interaction, but do not seek to state broad hypotheses about their nature. Henry Kissinger may have been an exception to that. And diplomats are particularly hostile to deductive reasoning from theory. Diplomats must be practical. And it's interesting that some of the best diplomats in the world are French, who would prefer the world operated on the basis of deductive theory. This is particularly important because diplomats seek satisfaction in the anonymous achievement of change rather than in the credential building of the publish or perish academic environment. Being known by name is not the objective of diplomats. It's what you're trying to accomplish. And then finally, the importance of diplomacy is neither to theorize about nor explain foreign behavior in general. That's what academics do and do very well. But to anticipate, manage, adjust, or cope with particular instances of foreign behavior. So that's a pretty nice list that Chaz has given us. And it's a nice way of framing, I think, what George Shultz has taught me as well. Shultz was an interesting guy because he was an academic by background. He came into the State Department, career in different parts of the U.S. government, but he came with a deep respect for what professional diplomats could do to make his job easier. Shultz used to invite new ambassadors to come into his office on the 7th floor of the State Department. And in the center of the office was this globe, just a huge globe. It must have been 4 feet in diameter. And he would ask the ambassador, "Show me your country." And the American ambassador, if they were going to France, would point to France, or if they were going to the Bahamas, would point to the Bahamas, or Togo and point to Togo, except for former Senator Ambassador Mike Mansfield, who was going to Japan. He did the spin the globe trick for Ambassador Mansfield, and Mansfield's finger stopped on the United States. He said, "This is my country." Never forget, as diplomats, who you represent. You represent the a country to which you're going to be playing these roles, and that is your objective, to carry out foreign policy of that country. Just some brief points that Shultz put together, and you can find his books. He's got a very nice book about his time as Secretary of State, and is really worth reading. He speaks of diplomacy as being a fundamental human activity that's conducted between people as well as nations. So you may sit behind the label of Norway, Senegal, Togo, but you're a person, and the people behind that other label are a person as well, and you need to understand that's diplomacy. Diplomats must speak with authority for the nation they represent. People don't care what you think personally. They want to know, what does your country think, and what are you as its representative trying to accomplish? Diplomats want to make sure the person on the other side of the table speaks with similar authority. And I've been in situations where the person on the other side of the table didn't have the authority that they purported to have. Diplomacy involves, and this is the hardest thing, particularly in the current political environment, diplomacy involves benefits to both parties. You don't win, you don't lose, you achieve a compromise. And negotiations to achieve those compromises, that's what diplomacy is an exercise of. These are processes and not one-off events. I'm sorry. Your negotiations are not a real estate deal in New York. It's a process that's going to extend far beyond the meetings that you conduct. Diplomacy requires accurate and relevant information. There's no room for false news in diplomacy. And his last point, Secretary Shultz, is probably the most important one, that skillful diplomacy requires gardening, even when there aren't major earth-shaking problems at stake. Diplomacy is day in, day out, hard work on things that may not necessarily be on the evening news. So, some final thoughts. We're living in a period where the trusted instrument of international engagement seems to be the application of military force. This is not unusual, but it certainly is something that I've not experienced in the degree that I see it today. We have an administration in Washington that prefers hard power over soft power. That's what diplomacy is about. And unilateral approaches versus multilateral. I need to look to the background of this story, but the president just announced that he's instructed his administration to look into joining the Trans-Pacific Partnership. If you go back to the beginning of the Trump administration, that was one of the first things he criticized, because it was a multilateral trade agreement that gave other people benefits and deprived Americans of them. Multilateral diplomacy and frameworks are very important, and that's why what you're doing is important. It's not sustainable to simply rely on hard power. We need diplomats, we need diplomacy. So for all of you out there who are able, take the Foreign Service exam. We need you, the country needs you. And, you know, this is a rocky period, but do it. Above all, mind your morals. It actually isn't true that the definition of a diplomat is someone who lies for his or her country. A diplomat pursues his or her country's interest, but based on honesty and trust. And when you retire, the one thing that you'll take away from your career is the integrity that you bring to your profession. Diplomats also must speak truth to power when necessary, and that's why diplomats sometimes dissent with ongoing policies. But let me stop there and only say, have fun in this simulation. I can think of no better way to learn diplomacy than what you're going to be doing.
And this is also a gift to you.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
At this time, I'm going to introduce the rest of the executive staff. First, your Director General for SRMUN Charlotte 2018, Ms. Desiree Kennedy. Our Deputy Director General, Ms. Kayla Bello. And the Undersecretary General, Mrs. Brittany Cabrera Tejia. And at this time, I'm going to ask that my trusted Director General and Deputy Director General go to the bottom of the stairs, so that way we can introduce our conference staff. Director for the General Assembly Plenary, Ms. Sydney Abel. I'm actually going to ask that we hold the applause until we're all done, just because I got to go through a lot of them. And her assistant director is Ms. Sloan Perkins. Thank you. Director for the International Renewable Energy Agency, Nicholas Edwards. Assistant Director, Mackenzie Adamson. Director for the Economic and Social Council, Garrison Davis. And Assistant Director, Callahan Moore. Director for the United Nations Development Program, Emily Grassett. Assistant Director, Lindsay Pendleton. Director for the African Development Bank, Zachary Greiger. And Assistant Director, Helen Smith. Presiding Judge for the International Criminal Court, May Po Ho Man. And Registrar, Andrea Greer. Director for the Security Council, Vanessa Dubélé. Assistant Director, Claudia Tio. And lastly, our Assistant Undersecretary General, Ms. Preberry. Now that all of that is settled, let's have fun, and SRMUN Charlotte 2018 officially open.